Good morning, everybody. Good morning, good morning. Wonderful to see you. Welcome to Washington Hebrew Congregation's Amram Scholar Series. I am Rabbi Eliana Fischel, and I look forward to this morning's presentation, which we bring to you in partnership with the Jewish Book Council. Thank God for them. We are grateful to Phil Hochberg, as today's Amram is sponsored by the Abraham and Frida Hochberg Creative Cultural Fund. The Amram Scholar Series offers a stimulating program of free lectures throughout the year in which world-renowned speakers, authors, scholars, political leaders, policy analysts, journalists, theologians, and more share their perspectives on timely issues or their research into history. I feel like today is a little bit of both. The program traces its beginnings to the fall of 1954, when the congregation moved to our Macomb Street home. That fall, participating in a nationwide celebration marking the 300th anniversary of Jewish settlement in the United States, Washington Hebrew launched what would become this widely recognized Sunday morning lecture program. As mentioned, today's Amram's lecture is also sponsored by the Hochberg family and the Abraham and Frida Hochberg Creative Cultural Fund. We want to thank their son, Phil Hochberg, and daughter, Marilyn Hammerman, for their ongoing support of the Amram Scholar Series. As many here know, Phil was the stadium announcer for the old Washington Senators and a consultant on sports to Smithsonian Associates. I didn't know that. Rabbi Shankman gave me that information, as well as a longtime attorney in the sports field. Phil and his late wife, Jane, were strong supporters of opportunities like the Amram Scholar Series to bring adults together for deep learning and thoughtful dialogue on a range of issues relevant to our congregation and community. This morning, we will have the opportunity to hear from Ms. Rachel Shteir, who will share a bit about her book, Betty Friedan, Magnificent Disruptor, after which we will have an opportunity for Q&A and conversation. At the conclusion of our program, Ms. Shteir will be signing books. Again, we are grateful to the Jewish Book Council for helping to make this program possible. Now to our author and guest. Rachel Shteir is an award-winning essayist, writer, and critic, and is head of the Dramaturgy and Dramatic Criticism program at the Theater School of DePaul University. She is the author of a few other books: Striptease, The Untold History of the Girly Show; Gypsy, I know, that sounds awesome, Gypsy, The Art of the Tease, and The Steal, A Cultural History of Shoplifting. Her most recent, I know, like really fascinating. This one's really fascinating too, I promise. Her most recent book, Betty Friedan, Magnificent Disruptor, has been met with much acclaim, including being honored as a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Awards in biography, we find out later this month, and a New Yorker Best of the Week pick. Not to mention, I was riveted as I was reading. Ms. Shteir, we are so excited to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, and good morning. I'm thrilled to be here, and I want to first thank the Jewish Book Council and Washington Hebrew for making this possible. What I would like to, I'm going to talk for about 35 minutes or so about my new biography, and I would like to start first by telling you a tiny bit about how I came to write this book. Because as you just heard from my brief bio, my first three books do not have anything to do with Betty Friedan, right? The subjects were quite different. And so I find that it can sometimes be helpful for audiences to be able to situate that. 10 years ago, 11 years ago now, actually, in 2013, it was the 50th anniversary of the Feminine Mystique, Betty's, which is, I'm going to call her Betty because I worked on this book for 7 years, and so I feel like I have a right to the first name. Okay, and so yes, in 2013, it was the 50th anniversary of the Feminine Mystique, and I was asked to write an essay about the feminine mystique and where we were with that, et cetera, and also to compare that with other more recently, at the time, recently published books by feminist authors. One of those books you might remember was Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg, for example, just to give you an idea. And at the time, I had not read The Feminine Mystique. So I started to read The Feminine Mystique, and I was blown away. And I highly recommend to everybody in this room, if you haven't read it recently, if you have a dog-eared copy somewhere in your home, to go and read it. It is amazing. It is powerful. It is intimate. It's what it is observing and prescribing from our perspective today is in a way quite modest. For example, it does not really make political recommendations, with the exception of saying there should be universal childcare. That is pretty much the only thing that Betty says in the book, that should be done politically, that government should do. However, it lays the ground for every conversation that has been had since then about feminism, and that is the extraordinary thing about it. You may remember that the book, it diagnoses the problem that has no name, which was, what was that? Essentially, that was the fact that in the late 1950s and early 60s, when Betty was writing The Feminine Mystique, women were encouraged to be housewives and mothers, and Betty felt that they were trapped in those roles. And so the book deals with the entrapment of women in those roles in a number of realms. For example, Madison Avenue and advertising, higher education, what else? Those are two of the central roles. But anyway, what I'm gotten a little bit off of, I'm going on a little bit of a tangent from my story, although I think it's important to talk about specifically what is and is not in The Feminine Mystique. But so anyway, I set out to write this piece in 2013, and as I was saying, I was blown away by The Feminine Mystique, but then the other books I was not blown away by. In fact, I was quite disappointed in them. Either they were very derivative of Betty, in other words, they basically stole from her ideas, or the recommendations that they made were just not that interesting, and they weren't that powerfully written. So this was the piece that I wrote in 2013. It was about how the feminine mystique, it should be reintroduced into the conversation about women's rights and women's justice. And a lot of people really liked this piece, and not long after that, I was asked to write this book for this series, Yale Jewish Lives, which is a really wonderful series which has published many biographies of many different figures. Now, I will just tell you that at the time that I was asked to do this, I was initially a little bit reluctant to do it. And one of the reasons was, as I was doing research for the article, I, of course, read about Betty's life. And I read previous biographies of her that had been published in the 1990s. And one of the challenges about writing about Betty and the feminine mystique is that she has been marginalized, right? She had been marginalized. That was my discovery. And one of the reasons I began to feel was because of her character as opposed to her work. And I will say more about that later, but I was a little bit reluctant when I was first asked to write this book, and I wasn't sure that I wanted to do it. Just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, for example, the books that were written about her in the 1990s were quite negative towards her, right, towards her character, and there are famous stories about this. But eventually, as I continued to do research, I began to feel like I have something to contribute here, which is a corrective. I can write a corrective, and I can reverse, or at least in some way temper, the idea that Betty's marginalization and her her fiery temperament. She had quite a fiery temperament. Do not mean that she should be marginalized, that we should be still talking about her and her ideas. So I took on this assignment and I thought, oh, I will be able to finish this book in 2 years and I'll be done and dusted. That was not what happened. Because as I went on, I realized that the responsibility of writing about an iconic figure like Betty began to weigh quite heavily on me, and I began to think, I really have to do this justice. Okay, so that's in brief the story of how I came to write the book. And now I want to just tell you, I'm going to outline for you a little bit about her biography and trying to extract some of the places where I feel like I say something different about her. I think the first thing you need to know is that Betty was a Midwesterner. She was born in Peoria, Illinois, which is a small town about 3 hours directly south of Chicago. And that the fact of her being a Midwesterner shaped her. Betty was actually quite conservative in many ways, which became important later when she co-founded the National Organization for Women in 1966, and then fought with them and exited that organization because she felt that they were too radical. When she was growing up, her family was one of the few Jewish families in Peoria, Illinois, and they were victims of anti-Semitism. Betty herself was a victim of anti-Semitism, of something that she was not able to talk about until the 1970s. In other words, she was born in 1921, and she was not really able to talk about her own Jewish identity until the 70s, so until she was in her 50s. However, it did shape her. These events did shape her, and they shaped specifically her feeling of being an outsider, shaped and drove her to try and correct women's role as an outsider, if that makes sense, right? But she did not draw that conclusion or that connection, as I said, until she was in her 50s. So she grew up in Peoria, Illinois, as I said, and she went to Smith College in 1938. Smith was where her mother went to school, or wanted to go to school, and her mother's father would not let her go to school there. So Betty was trying to correct what had happened to her mother by attending Smith. The Feminine Mystique is often talked about as a book that is about not living in the ways that our mothers lived. And sometimes it's also talked about as a book that was directly aimed at Miriam, Betty's mother. Betty's mother was a housewife. And in her childhood and her young adulthood, Betty was very angry about this fact. She wanted her mother to do more. Her mother was a very poised and very beautiful, well-dressed, elegant person. And Betty, growing up, was a brainiac and a huge reader and a klutz. And she had her two siblings were much more, I would say, socially accomplished. And so Betty was the outsider even in her own family. And she had to figure out, as a child, she had to figure out ways to deal with that. And that, in my opinion, is where her some of her outbursts began. These date back even to when she was a child. And so, okay, she went to Smith College, however, and she was one of the most brilliant students at Smith College at the time. She won every award there. She started working on the school newspaper. She, what else did she do? She dabbled in the theater, although she herself said that she could never work in the theater because she didn't, or in film, because she didn't feel that she was attractive enough. She majored in psychology, and she graduated from Smith in 1942, and right away she went to Berkeley for 1 year, and she studied with all the greats at Berkeley in psychology, including Erik Erikson and other famous names in that field that I'm sure you are aware of, but she dropped out. She had started to also, in addition to doing journalism in college, she also started to dabble in activism, in left-wing activism, and she felt at Berkeley that she was not being active enough in the political sphere. Also at Berkeley, she began to date. She dated a number of Robert Oppenheimer's proteges. And however, the one that she was most involved with broke up with her because she won a huge award at Berkeley. And this became a famous story in the Feminine Mystique that she tells. And in that story, she talks about their breakup and how he said, I don't know, how we can ever be together because you won this gigantic award and I don't feel that I will ever win an award. And that for her was part of the feminine mystique, the idea that women were being encouraged to not achieve. So anyway, she left Berkeley, she moved to New York, she started working as a left-wing journalist for various newspapers and trade publications. And she wrote many, many, many articles about all sorts of things, Jim Crow, also anti-Semitism, also women, and by 1946, she had met her husband. They had gotten married. But one interesting thing about Betty is that even after she had children, really like the minute after each of her children were born, she went back to work immediately. She was driven to not fall into what she saw as her mother's trap of being a housewife. But eventually, as the 40s went on, and she had more children, that became harder, right? It's one thing when you have one child to do it, but if you have 3 children, it's difficult. And also the family moved out of the city to Rockland County, New York, to a town called Grandview on Hudson, which is across from what used to be known as the Tappan Zee Bridge. The house that they moved into was a gigantic Queen Anne house. And so Betty, for the first time, was put in the position of having to figure out how to manage this house, which was a 3-story house, and also take care of her children. And her husband was commuting into the city every day, and so she was alone. And by this time, she had to give up working as a daily journalist. She had transitioned to doing freelance work for general interest women's magazines like Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping, and so on. And again, she wrote about a number of different subjects. And sometimes she neglected the children in order to continue doing her work. There's a famous story about her daughter knocking on the door of Betty's study and saying, Mommy, Mommy, here's a May Day bouquet for you, or something like that. And she didn't answer, right? She was on deadline trying to finish her assignment. And it's out of this period, though, that Betty began to become interested in what had happened to her Smith cohort, right? What had happened to all the really brilliant women she had gone to school with at Smith, because by now we're 10 years, 15 years after that. And so Betty created a questionnaire with the help of some social scientists who were her next-door neighbors. She created this questionnaire, and the questionnaire had all kinds of questions on it, from intimate questions like, do you talk to your husband after you've had a fight, to are you happy with your life currently, that sort of thing. And at her 15-year reunion, which was in 1957, she passed out this questionnaire. She had people fill it out, and then she got the answers back, and she worked on them. She worked on compiling all the data. And out of that, she wrote an article, and the article is called Is education wasted on women? That was the title of the article, question mark, rhetorical question. And she tried to sell this article to the magazines that she had been writing for, and she was not able to sell it. She tried again. Betty was very stubborn. That was another one of her, or tenacious, you could say. That was another one of her qualities. So she kept sending the article out, and each time it got rejected, she kept doing more research, and she kept rewriting it. But no one wanted it. No one wanted to publish an article about how going to college was valuable for women in 1957. So eventually, Betty met, by chance, the editor of W.W. Norton, and she sold this idea as a book. And that was the beginning of the Feminine Mystique. And so it took her longer to write her book. Also, it takes everybody longer to write their book than they think. And the book came out in 1963, February of 1963, and it was a sensation. Women would stop Betty in the streets and say, "You changed my life." That was a famous thing. She toured all over the country talking about her book. She became very much in demand. There were criticisms of the book from the very first moment that it was published. Some people said it did not include Black women or lesbians. Other people said it's only about upper-class housewives or middle-class housewives. Betty's point of view about this was she was trying to create the category of women, a category of women. She was trying to advance women's issues as a social problem that was in the same realm or on the same level as other social problems that were then being discussed at the time, that were then in the public sphere. Other problems like, urban development in New York was one that was much discussed. And I cannot underestimate the amount that she had to fight to get the idea of women's issues, to champion that idea. When you look back at the media records of her appearances and so on, some of them are just plain old contemptuous of this idea. Some of them are, basically saying, well, women's issues should not be discussed. It should not be given the same respect as these other social problems, et cetera. Okay, so, but for Betty, I guess the point that I want to make is that the publication of the Feminine Mystique transformed her life in many ways, as it transformed the lives of many women. Many women read it, and for them, the Feminine Mystique confirmed that they were not alone in their houses worrying about who they were by themselves, that many, many other people felt this. You probably know, I'll just read one thing from this. You probably know the famous first paragraph, which is, "The problem lay buried, unspoken for many years in the minds of American women. It was a strange stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction, a yearning that women suffered in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. Each suburban wife struggled with it alone, as she made the beds, shopped for groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night. She was afraid to ask even of herself the silent question, is this all?" Okay, that's the famous first paragraph. And then you may also know, this is the last paragraph. "Who knows what women can be when they are finally free to become themselves? Who knows what women's intelligence will contribute when it can be nourished without denying love? Who knows of the possibilities of love when men and women share not only children, home, and garden, not only the fulfillment of their biological roles, but the responsibilities and passion of the work that creates the human future and the full human knowledge of who we are? It has barely begun, the search of women for themselves, but the time is at hand when the voices of the feminine mystique can no longer drown out the inner voice that is driving women on to become complete." So Betty published this book, And as I said, she was touring. This was in '63, and from her perspective, things were not happening quickly enough. The changes that she envisioned were not happening. Women were not becoming equal. Meanwhile, civil rights was happening. And so she compared the sort of stagnation of women's rights with what was happening in civil rights, and she began to get very angry. And she began to also think that maybe a book was not enough to change women's lives. Maybe there needed to be a movement. And so in 1966, she co-founded the National Organization for Women. And the National Organization for Women, again, from our perspective today, it's perhaps very modest. For example, it always wanted to include men in its activism. On the platform of the National Organization for Women are things that are very basic, although one might also add that they have not really been achieved. Those things are reproductive rights, again, universal child care, equal pay for women, and equal representation in politics. Those were the kind of pillars of the National Organization for Women. And so in this period, after '66, Betty was the president. She was the first president. She did not want to be president. She, as she said famously, "I have the temperament of a writer." Okay, right? She knew that she was maybe not suited to a role where a great deal of diplomacy would be required. But people continued to ask her, and so she eventually gave in. And she was the president for the first 4 years. And in those 4 years, from 1966 to 1970, the number of things that now accomplished is extraordinary. The legislation that was passed, things like no sexist language in help wanted ads was one really basic thing. Also, just no sexism in general in job descriptions was another thing. And during this time also, Betty was incredibly active in trying to go all over the country and jumpstart chapters of NOW. Her calendar, which I've looked at, which is in the Schlesinger Library at Harvard, is just, it's so full. I mean, it made me tired just to look at her activities on any given day. You know, it was like 5 a.m., go to the airport, 6 a.m., et cetera, et cetera. And, the efforts that she put into advancing NOW's cause was extraordinary. But then what happened is that, of course, the revolution of women did work to some extent. It did, so some things were working, and younger women who were coming into the women's movement had different ideas about what the revolution should be than Betty. For example, Betty famously did not want anyone's sexual identity to be at the center of the women's movement, and she called lesbians the lavender menace, right? Which is not a very nice thing to say in public at a National Organization for Women meeting. But it came from a place of her terror that anything could be used to discredit the women's movement. And she worried that there could be, any chink in the unified front of the women's movement would cause it to be discredited, and it would stagnate or retreat or fall back. And so younger women, though, they wanted their sexual identities to be part of the women's movement. Radical women wanted their politics to be part of the women's movement. And so Betty began to fight with these women more and more. And in 1970, she stepped down off of the presidency. Right after that, she did engineer one of the most famous events of NOW, that is the strike for women's equality, which was in August of 1970. It was a nationwide strike celebrating suffrage, the passage of suffrage. And that strike really elevated the women's movement from a grassroots organization to a more organized institutional group, I would say. But Betty continued to move kind of more to the center, right, whereas the Now continued to be on the progressive left side. And Betty, after this period in the 70s and even into the 80s, Betty continued to try and found different organizations. She founded the National Women's Political Caucus, which was devoted just to getting women in political office. Here again, Betty fought with her co-founders, Gloria Steinem and Bella Abzug. For example, Betty wanted it to be about Democrats and Republicans. Gloria and Bella wanted it to only be progressive. And eventually Betty left that organization as well. I want to maybe mention, I don't know where I am on time, but I maybe want to mention, just because of this particular forum, I do want to mention, sort of circle back to her Jewishness. In the 80s, well, in the 1970s, Betty began to try and advance feminism globally. And she attended a number of conferences, UN-funded conferences. One was in Mexico City. Another one was in, I think, Czechoslovakia, and another one was in Nairobi. And these conferences, were bringing women, obviously bringing women together from all across the globe, not just American women, to talk about feminism. And at the 1975 one, Betty discovered that anti-Semitism in the women's movement. And she began to get very upset about that. And that was the galvanizing event for another transformation she had, which was to reacquaint herself with her Jewish identity. And after that, I would say in between 1975 and maybe even till the end of her life, but certainly like 1975 to, 85, 90, she worked for the Jewish community in a number of ways. When I say worked for, she sometimes fought with them too. But she also, she certainly supported women rabbis early on. She tried to also, she went to Israel several times. She helped Israeli women start the first independent women's organization there. She gave many, many talks herself at synagogues across the country. And she tried to, Betty was always pro-family. She believed that feminism did not have to be against the family. She herself, as I said, she was married, although she got divorced in 1970, but she had 3 children. And so she did not want, she wanted to communicate the idea that women's rights did not mean separatism, it did not mean anti-family rhetoric. It could be, it could work together with Judaism. At the time, not everybody agreed with that position, so she sometimes, as I said, did get into skirmishes. But she was committed to those ideas, and she continued. She continued to think of herself, I think, as a spiritual person rather than a religious one. Even until the end of her life, and although she is buried in the Jewish cemetery at Sag Harbor. Let's see. Maybe I like to sometimes read something, but I don't know what I will read. Let's see. Well, maybe, let's see. I can read from the end of her life. People, right, so what was the end of her life like? I think at the end of her life, she was very concerned that the women's movement had stagnated, and she told young women, she was constantly telling young women to take risks, and to try and continue to take risks. Okay, so this is I'll just read a tiny bit from this. This is about the end of her life. This is 2003, which was 3 years before she died. When she summered in Sag Harbor, she attended services at Temple Adass Sag Harbor, a Reform synagogue, the oldest one on Long Island, but she often fell asleep in the pews. She also attended the conservative synagogue of the Hamptons in Bridgehampton once or twice. In 2003, Jan Urbach, then a young rabbi there, hosted Friedan at Shabbat dinner. Friedan could not hear well, but she asked Urbach what it was like to be a woman rabbi. Had she experienced sexism? What did she do when she encountered it? I take control, Urbach said. Good for you, Friedan replied, adding that if Urbach had been a single man, the synagogue would have provided help for the dinner. I'm going to tell the board, she said. Okay. Okay, that's one thing. I could also read, here's from the very, very end of her life. In her lucid moments, Friedan advised her smart Jewish daughters to call for justice and take risks, even if it meant standing alone. She cared more about them carrying on than she did about her own well-being. She slowly succumbed to her many ailments, including late-onset diabetes and her heart problems, but she kept drinking and eating sugar until the end, refusing to do anything that others told her to do, as she had for her whole life. At the beginning of February 2006, Betty's niece Lori, Harry Jr., that's her brother, Harry Jr.'s daughter, flew to Washington to join Emily, Jonathan, Daniel, and their old friends, Steve Sloan and his wife, Estelle, at her bedside. It seemed that the end was near. Goodbyes were said, and Friedan asked to call her good friend of 40 years, the writer and editor Natalie Gildelson. They sent out for Chinese food, and Friedan said she didn't feel well. She never got back up. At 2:50 on the afternoon of February 4th, the end came. She died on her birthday like Moses. The writer Emily Bazelon, a relative on her mother's side, recalled, there was a lot of sorrow. The official cause of death was congestive heart failure. Okay, maybe I'll stop there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so
Okay.
much. You have such a good subject
Thank you.
to work with here. So I am currently teaching a class on the prophets every Wednesday, a little plug, Wednesday at 1 p.m. over Zoom, Newman's. Join us. And the whole time I was reading your book, I was thinking about so she's a prophet. Ooh, she's not a prophet.
Yes.
She's a prophet. She's not a prophet.
Yes.
And then her portrait was entitled The Prophet.
Yes.
And then you claimed it at the end of the
Yes.
epilogue too. So I'm wondering, how
Yes.
is Betty Friedan a prophet, both in
Well,
the wonderful ways and the messy ways?
Yeah.
And have we heard her call?
Oh, such a great question. You know what? Originally in the book, I had more on this subject, but it was cut. I mean, it was, the book is very long for the series, which is another subject maybe. But I consider her a prophet because she diagnosed and foretold something that nobody was talking about at the time, and people couldn't hear what she was saying. And not only could they not hear what she was saying, I mean, it seems at times I felt like it was as though she was speaking in tongues or something like that, and rejected, right? And that her call was rejected. So this is one of the things I was most torn up about while writing the book, actually, was, no, I don't think we've heard her call, because I think she has been marginalized and, and even erased. I think no one wants to listen. No one wanted to listen to what she had to say, partly because she said it in a way that people could not digest.
Yeah, which is a theme of the prophets too. They yell a lot, and then everyone gets sick of them.
They yell a lot, right? And they do stuff. Some of them are violent,
Absolutely.
right? Too,
yeah.
and they do strange things, right? Like lie down in the middle of the.
Which is interesting about her too, which is that I mean I know everything about her from your book, so which is. This idea that like and maybe it gets to the prophets too, that somehow her personality, I think you got there, her personality actually ends up hindering her cause.
Absolutely.
Because of this. And I'm wondering if that is true, or is that gender politics? If a man was yelling, would it be okay? Like what?
I mean, I think one of the reasons I ultimately decided that I wanted to work on this project was because of that very issue. And I do feel that, yes, she was harmed by gender politics. I mean, you only have to read the newspaper articles of the time about her, which are, including in the New York Times, are very derisive, often talking about like what she was wearing or like how she looked physically, and so there's that. And I think that just the whole idea of a women's movement, again, the media was quite contemptuous just of the idea and of her as a representative. I think when Gloria came along and took Betty's place in a way as a representative, the media was more accepting. Gloria was tall, she was beautiful, she was incredibly well-spoken. She did not have the same kind of antagonistic personality as Betty. And, the media liked that overall. But Gloria's politics were different, and her way of being an activist was different, and in some ways maybe not as effective, I would argue. I mean, Betty really had ideas about what should be done. I'm not sure Gloria had the same, level of thinking about it. But then on the other hand, I just would say, I think that the idea of gender politics as being responsible for Betty's marginalization and erasure only goes so far. Like, I cannot completely buy into it, because I think there are some things that she did that were just completely out of, they're out of bounds. I mean, they're out of bounds at the time, like the Lavender Menace. Everybody knew that was offensive at the time. And there are other things. So I think even if a man had said those things, they would have been marginalized. So I think it had to do with her character too.
And the things that she wanted to accomplish, that it was mind-boggling, right? You even listed them out really well, right? Universal child care, equal pay, equal representation in politics, and reproductive rights. And now
we have none of them.
Here we are, right? Without any of them, she tries so hard to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed. Even that hasn't passed. And then recently there was some article where it was quoted, "We are living in a time when embryos are people, but women are not." So if Friedan was here today. Like, how would she take on this moment?
I think she would be extremely upset about it, both about women, but also about the general tenor of the moment. I mean, because at the end of her life, she was concerned not just about women's issues, but also in general about the divide, like the increasing class divide. The haves and the have-nots, and the gigantic chasm in American society, poverty. She was incredibly concerned about that. So gun control, she was concerned about that. So she weighed in on a lot of, I guess, what I feel are the central issues of our time too.
And I guess the follow-up there is she did both, right? She wrote the books, and then she also organized. And what would she say we should do in this moment? Should we write the books or organize or do it all? Or?
I know. I think she would say a book is not enough. There has to be organization. I mean, it's tricky because you mentioned the ERA, which is so important. And when the ERA did not ratify, she was devastated, like a lot of women, and she felt that was like a death blow for the women's movement. Now I know there are some efforts to revive the ERA. I'm personally not optimistic about it, but some people are optimistic about it. But I don't know if it will happen. I mean, and if it does happen, I don't know. In a way, it seems like not of our moment. It seems like it's like something else from some other moment. It doesn't seem like the moment for it to happen. So I think she would certainly say that people should organize, that there's strength in numbers. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I have one more question, and then I'm going to hand it over to all of you. So start thinking a little bit. She did, as you said at the end there, she was not against family. And in fact, a lot of your book talks about her family and the generational trauma that existed within her family, with the ways in which she felt how her mom mothered her, and then how Emily, her daughter, reacts to her, and how she handles Emily. And so I'm a newish mom. And after her life and all she saw, I don't know if I would take mothering mom, to pointers from her, but after all she saw and experienced, like what do you think would be some of her do's and don'ts? And then also on mothering, but also on mentoring too, right? At the end there, you mentioned how she was so in saying take risks, but she got mad at young feminists like throughout her life. So what would she share?
I mean, that's incredibly complicated to answer that. I mean, yes. So first of all, she herself had a very complicated relationship with her mother, and then with her daughter. And, but one of the things I worked really hard to do in the book is to not cast her as a bad mother, because although I told an anecdote about how she didn't answer the door when her daughter needed attention, and that's true, and there are many stories like that, there are also many stories about things that she and her husband, Carl, did do for the kids that were amazing. Like they all went out into the backyard and camped out there the night that Sputnik was going on, and so there were some ways that she was an amazing mom, and then there were other things that she did that were less amazing. So it was very uneven, and I think the main feature of her being a mom was that she just was not going to give up her work life, and it really affected her daughter because her daughter was the youngest. The boys were, they were mostly, one was already in college and one was in high school when the Feminine Mystique came out, but her daughter was younger, and so her daughter was the one who bore the brunt both of the divorce, which happened in 1970, and then her mom traveling all over, not being home a lot and stuff. And then you're right to also mention mentorship, because later in life she mentored a number of younger women. I think they became her daughters in ways that her daughter was not, her actual daughter was not. And that was very poignant to read about and write about. But you're also right to say she also was very derisive herself towards younger feminists and would often scold them and attack them and so on. So I don't know. She had a complex. Again, I don't think there's any neat way to boil it down. I think she wanted younger women to take risks, and she wanted them to be bold. I think she sometimes wanted them to only do it in the way that she did it, and she wanted them to mirror her. Maybe that's not fit. I guess that's the trap that you fall into as a parent, right? You have to allow your kids to do what they want, not just what you want for them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Some questions from our crowd. Yeah, Paula.
I'm the product of Smith College. Betty
I was actually, when she said it, I was like, I feel like we could raise hands as who graduated from Smith here, but yeah.
Betty Friedan had the ideas. She did know how to gracefully do the marketing. Gloria Steinem do the marketing. But they both came out of the same
Smith,
tradition where
yes.
women were educated
Yes.
to be
Yeah.
forceful in society.
To be strong, yeah.
And so I think her personality got in the way
Yes.
of her vision.
Absolutely.
And there was no transition into a society where you had to know how to market your ideas, and she didn't. So it's unfortunate because she does get sidelined. But they came out of a tradition that definitely promoted that women
Yeah.
had minds and had ideas and they should go out in the world and do what they can. But being a product of the time that she was born, you know, I graduated, well, I didn't graduate from Smith, but I was the class of 62. So 58 to 62 was a transition.
Absolutely.
And you were not allowed to get married and stay on campus.
Right.
That's why I left. There was a man president. There was anti-Semitism.
Right.
There were
Right.
5 Jews in the freshman class in my dorm.
Right.
I was the odd one. They gave the 2 double rooms to the 2 Jews.
To the Jew. They did that for Betty also.
They
Yeah.
made a new room for
Yeah.
the sophomore who was Jewish,
Yeah.
with whom I had nothing in common.
Right.
I wanted to be part of my class. So why she picked Smith, I understand your reasoning, but I also say that was not the place for her. Given her history of anti-Semitism in Peoria. The other thing is I find the fact she went from Smith to Berkeley amazing because I went from Smith to Cornell, which was very similar.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's a culture shock.
Yeah.
But yeah, if she had known how to pass on the mantle and not allow them to sideline her, and they did because of her personality, she would have stayed in the limelight a lot longer. But you are what you are, you know. So,
You are what you are.
yeah.
Thank you.
For sure.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm curious if she ever knew a psychiatrist at Wellesley, Jean Baker Miller, who wrote a book that came out, I guess, after she died, called A New Psychology for Women, and it was really challenging the traditional psychoanalytic belief that women were dependent, and that was a pathology.
I don't know, but the Feminine Mystique does take on Freud, and it attacks Freud as being sexist, misogynist, and so on, and that's a whole chapter. So maybe this person read the Feminine Mystique and was influenced by it. Is that a possibility?
They were close in age.
They were close in age. Yeah. Huh. Yeah.
I'm going to repeat the questions too to make sure that we all hear them. So I apologize for that. But yeah, Sylvia.
Several decades ago, Betty Friedan spoke at Washington Hebrew. And there was a speakers bureau at that time. And Rabbi Lustig and I were involved in bringing her here.
Amazing.
And when we talk about her personality, I met it firsthand. When my husband and I went to pick her up at the airport, and I went to help her. She was older than I, of course, and wanted to help her with her luggage, and she was very feisty. I can do everything myself.
Yeah.
I was very impressed as this older person coming from Atlanta at night and doing her activities. And then my husband and I were bringing her some little snacks and some drinks and put nice music on in the car. And she gets in the car and she says, "Turn off that darn music." And that was my first impression.
Wow.
However, she did speak, of course, here, and she was marvelous, and I think she was a great influence. I really and truly believe this. You know, this other woman said that she was in the class of the 60s. I was in the class of the 60s. There was one woman who went to law school in my graduating class from college. And now, of course, there are tremendous amounts and quantity and quality of women.
True.
I think she was a great influence. I don't know if her personality detracted from what she did, but I think she really is a woman of valor. And I think that there were great changes, and she helped to bring them about. She really did.
Thank you. Other questions? Yeah, Sandra.
I just want to comment that last night I watched on HBO Mona Lisa's Smile. It's about a teacher at Wellesley College. I think it was the late 50s, maybe early 60s, who was trying to tell the women there that they didn't have to be wives and housewives, but they could go and they could be lawyers also. And she was expelled from Wellesley. but the students loved her. And it's with Julia Roberts. It's a wonderful movie.
It is. It's very lovely. It's a really good movie. Yeah.
One
Other
of the
questions?
things that you might find interesting is someone picked up the mantle of doing a survey at the reunions at Smith, Celine Sullivan. And she did them every reunion that I went to every 5 years with the class, and also with the same class at Yale, and then published the results. And it was fascinating how women and how men of that generation looked at different things.
Fascinating. Yeah.
These surveys were mostly, if the assumption's right, of white women, correct?
Yeah.
Her entire, is it
The-
fair or unfair?
The cohort at Smith at the time,
So
yeah.
that the preceding surveys
Yes.
would be the same white
Yes.
women.
So sorry, the question is,
Mostly.
Is it unfair for me to assume, therefore, that all the outcomes of a survey like that are quite limited? De facto, you know, I mean.
Yeah. Yes, and the Feminine Mystique was critiqued from the very moment it was published by historians, right, for that, right? So, yes, and there's been some scholarship about, about the Feminine Mystique's limitations. However, I also want to say that I've looked at the drafts of the Feminine Mystique, not just the published version of it, and it actually, Betty did try to make the book about more than just the Smith cohort and more than about just white women. However, those parts, and even to make it more about Jewish women, it's not really about Jewish women at all. It barely even uses the word Jewish. But in the drafts, it does. And those sections were cut ostensibly by her editor. The book is really, really long. For those of you who read it, it's actually, even as it is, it's somewhat repetitive. And I'm sure that W.W. Norton probably thought, well, there's no, what's the connection here between, these women and the women you're talking about in the suburbs, right? Because at the time, that would have been the thinking. So I just mentioned that because, yes, you're right. However, I also think she was trying to do more than that. She was trying to really advance something bigger than just about white suburbia. It doesn't really read in the book as it's published so much.
thank you. Yeah.
To what extent was her husband supportive of her activities, and why did they divorce?
Okay,
I'm
so
going to repeat it because I realize it's being recorded. So in what ways was her husband supportive of her activities or not?
one of the great tragedies of Betty's life is that she had an unhappy marriage, even a violent and volatile marriage. So he was not supportive at all, in contrast to Bella Abzug, who had a happy marriage and her husband was very supportive of her. And so, yeah, they when they divorced, she waited for so long to get divorced, although the marriage was, as I said, it was violent, and that's well documented. It's not just my research. Other people have also documented it. But she waited until 1970 because she was afraid that if she got divorced, it would in some way negatively affect the movement that she had built. People would say, oh, a divorcee has created the women's movement, right? So, we can just disregard this. Having said that, she and Carl, that was her husband's name, Carl, remained friendly. I don't know. They definitely, they were in contact for many years, until Betty wrote a memoir in 2000, and that talked more openly about the violence in the marriage, and Carl then became very angry and disputed her account of things. And it was not a particularly, what word do I want to use, attractive episode in her life, right? It was a very unfortunate episode in her life, and I still wonder. The memoir
I know why she wrote it, but I think it's unfortunate the way that it turned out, if that makes sense.
And when you say the marriage was violent, it was violent for both partners.
Yeah, both of them actually physically hit each other, yeah.
I wonder what has become of her children, do you know?
Yes, I do.
The question is, what's become of her children?
Yes, they're all very successful, and they all have their own families. One daughter is the daughter is a pediatrician. One of the sons is an architect, and then the other son is a MacArthur Genius Grant award-winning physicist. And so they're all brilliant, and they all have their own very extensive careers and families also.
Underachievers, yeah. Mm-hmm. I'll get you in a second.
I just wonder to what extent she interacted personally with the ideas of Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
How did she interact, if anything, with the ideas of, or personally, with Ruth Bader Ginsburg?
I could not find any documented interaction between any letters, correspondence, anything like that between Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Betty. My understanding is that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was briefly a member of NOW and then almost immediately went to the ACLU, where she felt like she could have a bigger impact because the focus of it was legal.
Interesting. Yeah.
A couple of questions. First, was her mother a college graduate? Did she go to college?
Was her mother a college graduate?
No. Miriam, wait a minute. Yes, I'm sorry. Miriam did go to Bradley University in Peoria after her father refused to let her go to Smith. And she worked, I think, for 1 year as a journalist at the local Peoria paper. However, I mean, Miriam's trajectory is very interesting because although it's true that when Betty was growing up, she was a housewife and she was also volunteering and so on. After Betty's father died in 1943, Miriam took over the jewelry store. He had a jewelry store. She ran the jewelry store. She got married several more times. She got divorced. She left Peoria and moved to Los Angeles. And she became a professional bridge player. And I mean, she had a whole other life, I guess is my point, that went way beyond what Betty's thinking about her was. So this to me is just very interesting, right? The way the parent perceives the child and how that can be so galvanizing in a negative way, but then actually Miriam had a whole life that was completely different. But Miriam, when Betty was growing up, Miriam was quite critical of her, and that stayed with Betty and haunted her.
She graduated during the war,
Yes.
and that had to
Yes.
hamper her.
Betty. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Sorry, Betty graduating during the war, and how did that have an effect on her?
Yes, it definitely had an effect on her politics, right? She moved far to the left during that time. I think also when she went to Berkeley, there were not that many men in her cohort. I think that was a fact. And then I think when she went to New York to get a job in journalism, I think the same thing was true. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if she, when you read about her writing, I'm just trying to think about her writing of that time. Okay, I know one thing I can tell you about. She was very concerned with fascism on American soil, and she became obsessed with that. And that, she wrote about that a number of times in her early journalism career. She thought that what happened in Europe could also take root in America, and she worried about that. So she was prescient in that way too, right? Yes, you're laughing, but yes, yeah.
Yeah.
How would you characterize her relationship with Roy Steinem?
Her relationship with Gloria Steinem, how would you characterize it?
Yeah, well, Gloria was 12 years younger than Betty. And Gloria actually, I think, was never a member of NOW. She was more interested in the more radical groups that were springing up in '68 and so on. You know, they were competitors and rivals, is what I would say about it. I mean, and Gloria got many things that Betty never got. I mean, like Smith honored her way before Smith honored Betty, for example. Gloria was on many magazine covers. Betty was really not on that many magazine covers. And Gloria was anointed as the leader of NOW, or the women's movement anyway, in a way that Betty was not. So they were rivals, and Betty, you know, then Betty made everything worse by attacking Gloria in public, which was quoted in the media. And Gloria took the high road, but Gloria never responded to Betty's attacks. So, right, so Betty wound up looking, you know, like the person who says something vicious, which is then quoted in the newspaper. But this was portrayed in the media as a catfight, and it was not really a catfight, it was ideological. As I said, they had different political perspectives, and to Betty, as I said, it was very important that Republican women be included in these conversations about reproductive rights and about political representation, and Gloria and Bella did not want that.
I was going to say from a slightly different generation than maybe others in the room, that to be like a millennial good feminist, you know who Gloria Steinem is, right? Like that's sort of what you know.
Yeah.
And Betty Friedan definitely not. Like she didn't get come down to us, right? And I think that's such an interesting. I don't know. That's an interesting phenomenon, right? That we get the person, we as in the next generation or a few generations next, get the person who was really good at PR, really good at marketing, looked gorgeous, right? Yeah.
Looked gorgeous, but also something you brought up, which is Gloria was very good at making connections with younger women and mentoring younger women, and she did not scold younger women. Okay, and Betty did, right? And so Gloria didn't make younger women feel bad for what they were not doing, and Betty did. Betty was like when in the 90s, when third wave feminism started, Betty was very critical of third wave feminists, and Gloria was not. Gloria tried to partner with them, you know, so that's why, you know, Gloria. Yeah.
Really fascinating. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Sorry to raise the second question.
No, please.
Something you just said made me think that Betty Friedan set the stage for Gloria Steinem. That if there had not been Betty Friedan, there would not have been Gloria Steinem. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I mean, I think another thing is Betty was Jewish. Gloria was half Jewish. And I think in the media that did make a difference, right? I think there was anti-Semitism in the media, and so that the way that Betty was covered by the media reflected that, and I think Gloria being half Jewish, like she somehow got some kind of a pass. But yes, I agree with what you're saying. Betty set it up.
Could I follow back to your point about when she became more aware of her
Jewishness?
identity,
Sure.
right? Which is to say that was she was
75. Yeah, she was already in her 50s because she was born in 21.
The question was about when she started to actually talk about her own Jewish identity was middle-aged or so, and yeah.
Did that moment in her life affect her feminism, her perspective on feminism? Did she suddenly fall into an understanding of Jewish ethics and Jewish values? And did that shift her own paradigm for her work?
Did that affect her feminism? Did understanding Jewish values or Jewish ritual or Jewish ethics affect the paradigm for feminism that she held?
That's such a great question, and it's hard for me to answer briefly. It depends what you mean by Jewish ethics, first of all. But I think, she had always been Jewish, even though she didn't acknowledge that. She was that Jewish secular person, right? And then when she was in her 50s and she began to become more involved in, I guess I would say, institutional Judaism, her conservatism came out. That was one thing that happened at around the same time. And I think this idea of the family being important, that came out. But ethics, there were, then on the other side of the question, there are certain things that other Jewish feminists did that Betty never did. Like there were feminist Shabbats and Passovers that were widely attended, like in New York feminist Judaism. Betty never went to those. Yeah, I don't know. She didn't suddenly start talking about Jewish ethics. I will say this, though. I think that her son is, I think, modern Orthodox. And I do think that had an effect on her. And she also studied, in the beginning of her life, like in the, not beginning of her life, but the beginning of her adult life as a feminist activist, like in the 60s, she was very interested in, again, these kind of Jewish secular things like Esalen. And then as time went on, she, especially with her son's growing religiosity, she became more interested in mystical Judaism specifically. And she did study that a little bit, especially for her, one of her later books is about aging. And so she did study Jewish mysticism a bit.
So my last question before we conclude, unless anyone else has a question, you speak really lovingly of her. You use her first name. You kind of light up when you talk about her. What is it that you love about Betty?
It was, what is it I love? I just love her tenacity and her, I am not going to give up even if I die on this hill quality. Mm-hmm. I think that's one thing. I think her enormous arc and her evolution. She did evolve as a thinker, and she was not afraid to talk about that. She was not afraid to say that she was wrong, like publicly, she was always apologizing for the horrifying things that she said. And people didn't always forgive her. I think there are so many things. I think her contentiousness, I love that. I think I just feel very close to her. Yeah. Thanks.
Beautiful. Thank you. I have to bring a little more Jewish Torah, at the end of this. It's my job. So I guess it was last week, so it was yesterday's Torah portion, we read about the golden calf, that the Israelites are feeling very lonely when Moses is atop the mountain and entice Aaron to create the golden calf. And Moses, upon coming down, gets unbelievably angry and sees the calf and smashes the tablets. And it's this big moment in religiosity, in what is sacred and what's holy, and in the use of anger to figure out ethics and to figure out what a society is supposed to look like. And I just feel like that's a really beautiful backdrop to Betty, right? That sometimes that you're right, that as you said and as you tried to correct, which I think you did beautifully, was her persona of angry, yelling,
righteous.
But it can also be that our anger can sometimes our righteous anger can sometimes allow us to break what needs to be broken in order to create a society that we envision.
Wow.
And Betty certainly did that, and thank you so much for bringing her story to life for us. Many of you are her contemporaries, but definitely for bringing it to life for the next generation. And we're so grateful that you're
here.
So
thank you so much.
Thank you. Absolutely. And thank you again to the Jewish Book Council. And of course, you are please, you're welcome to come by this beautiful book, Betty Friedan, Magnificent Disruptor, and talk to Ms. Shtier a little bit more. So thank you all for being here this morning.
Thank you so much.